The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the open plains ahead of them. The landscape seemed vast and endless, with rolling hills and patches of tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. Sarah squinted into the distance, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. For the first time in days, they were away from the dense forest and the threat of the outlaws. It felt like a small victory, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Kona led the way, his movements steady and deliberate as he guided them through the open land. The air was cooler now, and Sarah welcomed the chill against her skin. She sat a little straighter on the horse, trying to shake off the weariness that had settled into her bones. Lily sat in front of her, still clinging to her mother, but there was something different in her eyes now. The fear that had gripped her so tightly was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet curiosity. "Where are we going now, Kona?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but still filled with uncertainty. She had learned to trust him over the past days, but there was always that lingering question in the back of her mind. "We're headed for a small settlement," Kona answered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's not far. We can rest there for a while." Sarah's heart skipped at the mention of a settlement. She hadn't even dared to dream of finding a place where they could stop and recover, even for just a little while. Her life had been in constant motion since the attack by the outlaws, and the thought of finally having a place to rest felt almost too good to be true. But she didn't dare ask too many questions. The more she learned about Kona, the more she realized that there were things he wasn't ready to share. She would have to trust him. They rode on, the sound of hooves mixing with the quiet rustling of the grass around them. Sarah could feel the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders, the constant tension of being hunted now replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. As they rode, her mind drifted back to the journey that had led them here, the outlaws, the fear, and the warrior who had appeared like a shadow in the wilderness to protect them. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been a few days. So much had happened in such a short time. "Do you have a family?" Sarah asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. It was a question she had been meaning to ask but hadn't known how. Kona had never spoken much about himself, and it seemed like he preferred to keep things that way. But as they rode together, she couldn't help but wonder what had led him to this path. What was his story? Kona didn't answer right away. For a moment, Sarah thought he hadn't heard her, but then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I had a family," he said. "I lost them many years ago." Sarah felt a pang of sadness for him. She knew that loss in a way that was impossible to describe. It was a silent kind of pain, the kind that lingered long after the wounds had healed. She didn't ask more, she didn't need to. There was something in his voice that told her it was a wound he wasn't ready to talk about. It wasn't the first time she had heard of such loss in the wilderness. It seemed to be a part of life here, where survival was always uncertain and fragile. They continued riding, the sound of the horses' hooves steady and rhythmic. The sun had nearly dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted with soft hues of orange and pink. Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace in that moment. The world felt still, as though everything had paused for just a brief second, allowing them to catch their breath. Finally, Kona slowed his horse as they reached a small cluster of buildings in the distance. It wasn't a large settlement, but it looked like a safe place. There were a few cabins, a barn, and a well. A smoke trail rose from one of the chimneys, and Sarah could see the faint outlines of people moving around. Her heart quickened at the sight of other people. She hadn't spoken to anyone except Kona and Lily for days, and the idea of seeing other faces, hearing other voices, felt like a comfort. As they approached, Kona's posture stiffened. He was always on alert, and Sarah noticed that he seemed especially cautious as they neared the settlement. "Stay close," he murmured, glancing over at her. "I will," Sarah replied, her voice soft but firm. She wasn't going to let anything happen to Lily. Not now. Not ever. They rode through the small settlement, and Sarah could feel the eyes of the people there on them. Some of them glanced curiously at the Comanche warrior who had led them here, but no one said anything. Sarah could see the weariness in their eyes. These were people who had lived hard lives just like her, trying to survive in a world where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. But there was a warmth here too, a sense of community that Sarah hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like they were finally safe, even if only for a little while. Kona stopped his horse in front of a small cabin, and Sarah dismounted with Lily. The warrior tied his horse to a nearby post and turned to face her. You should rest here, he said quietly, his eyes softening for a brief moment. I will stay close, but I need to go for a while. You'll be safe here. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had no idea what Kona's plans were or what he was going to do next, but she trusted him. For the first time in a long while, she felt like they were finally safe. She could rest just for a little while, and that felt like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. Kona didn't wait for her to say anything more. He turned and walked toward the edge of the settlement, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Sarah watched him go, feeling a strange sense of loss even though she knew he would return. She didn't know what the future held, but for now she was grateful for this moment of peace. Inside the cabin, Sarah helped Lily get settled. The cabin was small but cozy, with a simple wooden table and a few chairs. A bed sat in the corner and a small stove provided warmth. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected to find in this wild, untamed land. She set down her things and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey lift off her shoulders for just a moment. Lily was already lying on the bed, her eyes heavy with sleep. Sarah sat beside her, running a gentle hand through her daughter's hair. She could feel the steady beat of her own heart, the rhythm of life that had brought them here against all odds. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was their life now. And as long as they had each other, that was enough. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to rest, to simply breathe. There was still much to do, much to worry about, but for now, she would let herself be in this small moment of peace. Kona returned later that evening, his expression unreadable as always. He didn't speak at first, but Sarah knew something had changed. She could see it in the way he carried himself. There was a quiet determination in him that she had come to respect, even if she didn't fully understand it. We will leave soon, Kona said finally, his voice steady and calm. But for tonight, rest. You've made it this far. Sarah looked at him, her heart full of gratitude and hope. Whatever came next, she knew they could face it together. They had survived the wilderness, the outlaws, and the danger. And with Kona by their side, she believed they could survive anything. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something stir inside her. A quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. The dawn came slowly, the sky turning a pale gray as the first light of morning crept through the trees. Sarah awoke to the soft chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts heavy with worry and uncertainty. The dangers of the wilderness felt like they were closing in on her, but there was nothing she could do except keep moving forward. Lily was still curled up in her arms, her face peaceful in sleep. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair gently, trying to comfort herself with the small, quiet moments. But the reality of their situation hit her as soon as she looked around the clearing. Kona, the warrior who had saved them, was already up, busy tending to the small campfire. His movements were efficient, practiced, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't seem tired even after the long night of watching over them. His eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings as if he could sense danger even before it arrived. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. It was time to leave, and she knew it. She couldn't afford to waste any more time in this vulnerable place. The outlaws were still out there, and Kona's warnings the night before echoed in her mind. They couldn't stay in one spot for long. She helped Lily to her feet, brushing the dirt from her clothes, and looked to Kona. "We're ready," she said softly, though her voice felt fragile. Kona didn't answer right away, but his eyes flicked to her with a brief nod. "We move quickly today," he said, his tone firm, almost like a command. "The outlaws are not far behind." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had hoped, prayed even, that the danger was behind them, but she could see now that the warrior was right. This wasn't over. They had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. She watched Kona as he saddled his horse, his muscles rippling under his worn shirt. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet determination. It was hard to tell if he was even worried, if he had any fear at all. Everything about him was focused, as if he had accepted the harsh realities of life in the wilderness and had learned how to deal with them. Sarah, on the other hand, felt the weight of everything on her shoulders. She had a child to protect and a new life growing inside her. She hadn't asked for any of this, but now it was her reality. She had to fight, even if she wasn't sure how. It was that thought that pushed her forward as she gathered their things and prepared to leave. Lily, still groggy from sleep, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Where are we going, Mama?" she asked in a small voice, the innocence of her question cutting through Sarah's anxiety. Sarah smiled at her daughter, trying to offer her some comfort. "We're just going to keep going, sweetheart. We'll be all right." She wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure Lily or herself, but she said the words anyway. It felt good to say them aloud, even if the truth of their situation felt much darker. Kona finished preparing the horse and turned to face them. "We leave now," he said, his voice once again calm and steady. Sarah nodded, feeling the rising urgency in his tone. There was no time to waste, and they had no other choice but to follow him. Without another word, she helped Lily onto the horse, settling behind her on the saddle. Kona mounted his own horse and led the way, moving swiftly through the trees. The woods around them were dense, the trail narrow and winding. Sarah could barely keep up with Kona's quick pace. Her legs ached, and the weight of the baby in her belly made every step harder. But there was no time to slow down. They had to move fast, and she had to keep up. As they rode deeper into the forest, Sarah tried to stay focused on the path ahead, but her mind kept wandering. The thought of the outlaws hunting them down was a constant presence in her thoughts, gnawing at her. What would happen if they found them again? Could Kona protect them a second time? What if they were outnumbered or outmatched? Her breath quickened, and she felt the familiar sense of panic begin to creep in. She tried to push it down, but the fear was hard to ignore. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a branch seemed to echo in her mind, filling her with dread. Kona must have noticed the tension in her because he slowed his pace, glancing back at her. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low but firm. "Worry won't help you. Focus on what you can control." Sarah nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to feeling so helpless, so vulnerable. Back home, she had always been in control of her life, of her future. But now she was at the mercy of this dangerous land and the warrior who had come to her rescue. It was a humbling experience. They rode on in silence for a long time. The only sounds, the soft thud of hooves on the forest floor, and the distant calls of birds in the trees. Sarah found it strangely peaceful, despite the danger that still lurked in the air. Kona moved like a shadow through the trees, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He had a way of blending into the wilderness as if he were one with it. Sarah couldn't help but admire his skill, even if she didn't fully understand it. They came to a small creek after a few hours of riding, its clear water trickling over the rocks. Kona stopped here, signaling for Sarah to dismount. "We rest here for a moment," he said, his tone still calm but insistent. "The outlaws will not find us here." Sarah was grateful for the break. Her legs were sore, and she was starting to feel the exhaustion setting in. She helped Lily off the horse, and they sat by the creek, drinking from the cool water. The sound of the water flowing was soothing, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to relax. But it didn't last long. Kona remained standing, his sharp eyes scanning the trees once again. He was always on alert, always watching, as if the slightest sound could mean danger. Sarah tried to shake the feeling that they were constantly being watched. She couldn't let fear control her. She had to stay strong for Lily, for the baby, and for herself. After a few minutes, Kona motioned for them to get ready to move again. "We don't have much time. We must keep going." Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. They couldn't stop for long, and the fear that they might be caught at any moment never really left her. The world around them felt like a maze of uncertainty, each turn bringing new dangers, but she had to keep moving forward, had to keep fighting for her daughter's safety. As they mounted their horses once more, Kona led the way, moving with the same quiet determination he had shown all along. Sarah followed closely behind, her thoughts swirling with questions and fears, but there was no time for doubts. Kona was the only thing standing between them and certain danger, and Sarah had to trust him, had to believe that they would make it through this. The trees began to thin out, and Sarah could see the open plains ahead. It was a small sign of hope, a brief glimpse of freedom, but she knew better than to let her guard down. There were still so many dangers ahead. As they rode toward the open land, Sarah took a deep breath, pushing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. They had survived this far, and with Kona by their side, she would keep fighting to protect her daughter and the new life growing inside her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to feel something other than fear, hope. They would survive. Together. The night was still and quiet. broken only by the crackling of the small fire that Sarah and her daughter huddled around. Sarah sat with her back against a tree, her arms wrapped tightly around Lily, who was dozing off in her lap. The cool air of the forest was a welcome relief after the heat of the day, but the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest remained. The man, this mysterious Comanche warrior, was still standing, his back to the fire as he scanned the darkened forest around them. His eyes were sharp, constantly shifting, ever watchful, as though he was waiting for something to happen. Sarah tried to relax, but every sound in the woods made her tense, every rustling leaf or snap of a twig putting her on edge. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that they were being hunted. Her mind kept returning to one question. Why had he helped them? He was a Comanche warrior, a member of a people who had been fighting settlers for years. Surely he knew who Sarah was, just another settler in the land the Comanches had long claimed as their own. Yet here he was, protecting her and Lily from the outlaws as though they were allies. "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked over at the man who still stood alert at the edge of the clearing. The warrior turned his head slightly, acknowledging her question. "I'll protect you," he said, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't much of an answer, but Sarah could hear the sincerity in it. She wanted to believe him. She had no choice but to believe him. This was the only chance they had. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, hoping that knowing something more about him would make her feel less like they were in a dream. A dangerous dream that could turn into a nightmare at any moment. The warrior hesitated for a moment, then answered in a low voice. "Kona. Kona," Sarah repeated softly, the name feeling strange on her tongue. She had never met anyone like him before, and she wasn't sure if she ever would again. "Thank you, Kona, you saved us." Kona nodded but said nothing more. He didn't seem to be someone who liked to talk much. Sarah found that odd, yet somehow comforting. His silence made her feel that he didn't need to explain himself. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. The night had settled in fully, the moon now a thin crescent high in the sky. The world around them felt vast and empty. It was a feeling that made Sarah uneasy, especially with the knowledge that outlaws were still out there, somewhere, looking for them. As the hours passed, the camp grew colder. Kona started to move, gathering the firewood that had been left untouched since the day's attack. His movements were smooth and deliberate, showing no sign of weariness despite the long day. Sarah watched him, noting how carefully he observed everything around them. He was always on guard, always alert. Lily stirred in her sleep, muttering softly in Sarah's arms, but she didn't wake. Sarah looked down at her daughter and gently brushed a lock of hair from her face. How had things gotten so complicated so quickly? Just days ago they had been traveling with excitement, full of hope for the future. Now they were running for their lives with no idea where they would end up. Kona turned to Sarah. "We move at dawn," he said simply. "The outlaws will not stop." Sarah nodded, already feeling the weight of the journey ahead. She wasn't sure how much further she could go, especially with the baby growing inside her. The last thing she wanted was to cause any trouble for Kona. He had already done so much for them. Yet she couldn't help but wonder, what would they do if the outlaws returned? Would they be able to outrun them again? "Kona," she began, unsure how to phrase her question. "Why are you helping us?" "You don't have to." Kona looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the fire. For a long moment he said nothing. Sarah wondered if he would answer at all. Finally he spoke. "It's not about you. It's about what is right." His words were simple, but they carried weight. "You are a mother and a child. You need protection. I provide it." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. She had heard the stories of Comanche warriors who fought fiercely for their land and their people, often at the expense of settlers like herself. But here was Kona offering protection, not violence. It didn't make sense, yet somehow it felt right. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. How could someone like him, someone who had likely lost so much to settlers, be so selfless? Was it simply duty to his own code, or was there something more? Whatever the reason, she was thankful for his help. "I don't know how to repay you," Sarah said softly. "You don't need to," Kona replied. "You owe me nothing." Sarah looked into his eyes then, trying to understand him, trying to make sense of the strange situation they were in. Kona was a mystery, but one thing was clear. He was more than just a warrior. He was a man with a strong sense of justice, someone who acted without needing anything in return. He was also a man who, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, had chosen to help her and Lily. "We'll move out at first light," Kona repeated, his voice steady, yet full of resolve. "I will keep you safe." Sarah nodded, feeling a new sense of determination. The thought of facing another day of traveling through the wilderness was daunting, but she knew they had no choice. She couldn't allow herself to break down. Not now. Not when she had her daughter to protect. And Kona, this warrior, was their only chance for survival. With a final glance at the horizon, Kona turned his back on the fire, his gaze scanning the trees again. And then he spoke to Sarah without turning to face her. "Sleep while you can," he advised. "Tomorrow will be harder." Sarah sighed deeply, trying to push aside the worry that threatened to overwhelm her. But as she looked down at Lily's peaceful face, she felt a new sense of responsibility, a fierce love and determination to keep them both alive. The night passed in silence, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. Sarah tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking of the outlaws, thinking of what they would do when they realized they had escaped. Would they give up or would they follow them until the end? As the stars moved slowly across the sky, Sarah finally drifted into a restless sleep, knowing that when the morning came, the journey would begin again. They had a long road ahead, and though it was uncertain, Sarah clung to the hope that Kona, this warrior who had appeared in their lives like a guardian angel, would be there to protect them through it all. Sarah could hardly believe her eyes. The man who had saved them seemed almost unreal, like something out of one of the old stories her grandmother used to tell. His calm, composed demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. His appearance alone was striking. He wore a weathered buckskin jacket, his face marked by the sun and wind, with long black hair tied back neatly. Despite his fierce presence, there was something about his eyes that gave Sarah a sense of relief, as though she could trust him, even though she knew nothing about him. He had saved their lives. But now Sarah couldn't help but wonder, who was this man and why was he here? The silence that followed was thick with tension. The outlaws had fled, but their absence didn't bring any comfort to Sarah. The danger wasn't gone, just postponed. She looked at Lily, who was still holding onto her side, eyes wide with fear. Her little face seemed pale in the fading light, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She had promised to keep Lily safe, but now, with everything that had happened, Sarah wasn't sure if she could keep that promise. The man on horseback finally spoke, his voice breaking the stillness. "Are you both all right?" Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I think so," she answered, her voice shaky. "Thank you for saving us." He nodded, but didn't say much more. Instead, he glanced around as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. His attention wasn't on Sarah or Lily anymore. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, the trees, the ground, all in one quick motion. It was as though he had been trained to always be alert. Are you a scout?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued by his skill and presence. The man didn't answer immediately. His focus remained fixed ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked back at Sarah. "No, I'm a warrior." The word caught Sarah off guard. A warrior! She had heard stories of Comanche warriors, their bravery, and their unmatched skill in battle. She had never expected to encounter one, let alone be saved by one. Comanches were known to be fierce fighters, skilled in the ways of the wilderness. She had heard whispers of their raids and their strong ties to the land, but she never imagined she'd meet one face to face, much less be rescued by one. Sarah was about to ask more questions, but the man cut her off, his gaze hardening. "The outlaws won't be far. We need to move." His urgency caught Sarah off guard. They had barely escaped, and yet here he was, already thinking about the next threat. She glanced down at Lily, who was still clutching her hand. Sarah could feel her daughter's fear radiating through her, and it broke her heart. But there was no time to comfort her, no time to do anything other than survive. With a quick motion, the man dismounted from his horse and moved toward Sarah. "We have to go," he said. "I'll protect you, but we must keep moving." Sarah hesitated, torn between her fear and her instincts. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him. But the outlaws were still out there, and her only choice was to follow this stranger and hope he could protect them. As much as she feared the unknown, she had no other choice. The wild frontier was a dangerous place, and Sarah had already seen how quickly things could turn violent. Taking a deep breath, Sarah nodded. "All right, let's go." Lily clung to her side, her small hand wrapped tightly around her mother's arm. They followed the man as he led them through the dense woods, his movements swift and sure. Sarah struggled to keep up with his pace, her pregnant belly making it harder to move quickly. She could feel the heat of the day weighing her down, and the thick forest seemed to close in around them. But the man didn't slow his pace. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew this land well, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. "We'll find shelter soon," he muttered as they walked. "But you need to stay close. If they're tracking us, they'll try to ambush us again." The thought of being hunted was enough to make Sarah's stomach turn. She had heard rumors of settlers being attacked in these parts, stories of people disappearing without a trace. She couldn't bear the thought of Lily becoming one of those stories. How did you find us?" Sarah asked, still trying to understand how this man had appeared out of nowhere. He didn't answer right away. For a moment, Sarah wondered if he'd heard her at all. But then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I was passing through. I've been traveling this land for some time now. I've seen outlaws before. I knew what they were doing. Are you alone?" Sarah asked, glancing at the man. It seemed odd that someone like him would be traveling alone, especially in such a dangerous area. "I am," he said simply. "Comanches don't travel in large groups. We don't need to." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She had always heard that the Comanche were a proud and independent people. But there was something about the way this man spoke that made her realize just how different their world was from hers. He didn't need anyone else. He had survived alone, and in a way, it made Sarah feel both small and in awe. The path ahead was narrow, the trees growing closer together as they moved deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and every so often Sarah would hear the rustling of leaves or the distant call of an animal. She couldn't help but wonder what dangers might be lurking just beyond her sight. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the man finally stopped. They had reached a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. It was eerily quiet, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They had made it to a temporary safety, or at least it seemed that way. "We'll rest here for the night," the man said, his tone brokering no argument. "But we leave at dawn. The outlaws will be looking for us." Sarah nodded, grateful for the pause. Her legs ached from the long walk, and Lily's tired little feet were dragging behind her. They hadn't stopped since the attack, and the weight of the day's events was beginning to settle in. The adrenaline that had kept her going was starting to wear off, and she felt the exhaustion in every muscle. The man, still alert, began to make camp. He moved quickly and efficiently, setting up a small fire and scanning the area for any signs of danger. Sarah watched him, trying to process everything that had happened. He was a mystery, dangerous, skilled, and yet in that moment he was their only chance for survival. As the night settled in, Sarah sat by the fire, keeping Lily close. The crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the air. The man, still standing watch, glanced over at them briefly, his eyes softening for just a moment before returning to his vigilance. In the warmth of the firelight, Sarah realized something. This was not just a random encounter. This man, this warrior, had saved them for a reason. He had risked his life to protect hers and Lily's, and for that she felt a deep sense of gratitude. But as she sat there in the flickering firelight, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. The world they were in now was unpredictable, and their survival depended on how well they could navigate the dangers ahead. She turned to Lily, who was slowly drifting off to sleep, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder. "We're safe for now," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to her daughter. "But we have a long road ahead." The warrior's eyes, ever watchful, remained fixed on the horizon. Sarah knew that this night was only a brief pause. The outlaws would return, and with them, new dangers would arise. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. Sarah Whitfield had always dreamed of a better life for herself and her daughter, Lily. It was the kind of dream that seemed out of reach for many settlers on the edge of the untamed land, but she believed in it with all her heart. Sarah and Lily had left behind everything they knew, hoping that the Texas wilderness would offer them a fresh start, far from the hardships of their past. It was a bright morning when they set out on the long journey, the sun rising behind them as they walked along the rugged trail. Sarah, heavily pregnant, felt the weight of the child inside her with every step. Her hand rested on her swollen belly and she smiled down at Lily, who skipped ahead with excitement. The days were long and the journey was hard, but Sarah kept a hopeful heart. She had no idea, however, that this journey would soon become a fight for their lives. They had been traveling for days, the path growing more isolated with each passing hour. The wilderness, with its beauty and danger, was both comforting and terrifying. The trees seemed to close in on them as they moved deeper into the unknown, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was just a nagging thought in the back of her mind, something every traveler in the frontier must learn to ignore. But that day, as they trudged along the dirt path, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that clung to the air. Without warning, the silence of the wilderness was shattered by the sound of galloping horses. The ground trembled beneath their feet and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned to Lily, her hand trembling as she grasped her daughter's arm. "Stay close to me, Lily," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. She had heard stories of lawless men, of outlaws who roamed the wilderness preying on vulnerable settlers, but never had she imagined she would be caught in such a situation. The riders appeared out of nowhere, coming around the bend in the trail at full speed. Sarah's eyes widened in fear as she saw them for the first time. The men wore rough, dusty clothes, their faces hardened by a life spent outside the law. Their eyes were cold and their horses snorted and stamped impatiently. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but the fear in her chest rooted her to the spot. The outlaws surrounded them, their horses blocking the path and making it impossible to escape. "Looks like we've got ourselves some easy pickings, boys," one of the men sneered. His voice was low and cruel, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. Sarah stepped protectively in front of Lily, her body tense with fear. She knew they were outnumbered, and there was no chance of outrunning them. Her heart raced as she struggled to think of what to do. The men didn't seem interested in talking, and she could already feel their eyes scanning her and Lily like they were nothing more than prey. "Please, we don't want any trouble," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're just passing through. We mean no harm." The man who had spoken earlier laughed, a harsh sound that sent shivers down Sarah's back. "No harm, huh? You're trespassing on our land. That's enough reason for us." Sarah's mind raced. They had heard of settlers being taken or even killed by outlaws like these. She thought of her unborn child and the life she was trying to protect. "Please," she said again, her voice desperate. "I'm pregnant and I have a little girl. We've done nothing wrong." But the man wasn't moved by her words. Instead, he nodded to one of his companions who dismounted with a rope in hand. "We've heard enough," he said, grinning. "Time to teach you a lesson." Before Sarah could react, the outlaw advanced on her, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. She gasped in pain as he pulled the rope tight around her wrists. Lily screamed in fear, and Sarah's heart broke as she turned to see her daughter's terrified face. "Let her go! She's just a child!" Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. The man gave a dismissive laugh. "We'll deal with the child after we're done with you." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she realized the full danger they were in. These men were not interested in a simple robbery or even a fight. They were intent on harming them. She could see the cruel intent in their eyes, and she knew that if they didn't act quickly, they would be left with nothing. One of the outlaws yanked Lily away from Sarah, pulling the girl by the arm and holding her roughly. Lily cried out, but the man silenced her with a sharp shove. Sarah's heart sank as she struggled against the ropes that bound her. She had to do something, anything, to protect her daughter. But as the seconds dragged on, Sarah began to feel an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Her strength was fading and the ropes were cutting into her skin. The sun, once bright and welcoming, now seemed to beat down on her with a suffocating heat. The world around her blurred, her thoughts spiraling in panic. She had no weapons, no way to fight back. Her only hope was that someone, anyone, would come to their rescue. Just as she thought she might lose all hope, a sound echoed from the trees ahead. The sound of a lone rider approaching. At first, Sarah thought it was just another one of the outlaws, but then she heard the distinct, powerful gallop of a horse. The rider was coming fast, and this time it wasn't an outlaw. In an instant, a man appeared from the trees, riding like the wind. He was dressed in buckskin, and had the posture of someone who was used to living on the land, accustomed to the dangers of the frontier. His face was hard, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing. A man who appeared out of nowhere just when all seemed lost. The outlaw holding Sarah's ropes turned, surprised by the unexpected arrival. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice filled with aggression. The rider didn't answer with words. He drew a bow and, in one smooth motion, fired an arrow that struck the ground at the outlaw's feet. The message was clear. This was not someone to be trifled with. The outlaws froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. But the rider didn't wait for them to make a move. He spurred his horse forward, charging straight into the group with the speed and grace of a seasoned warrior. In a matter of seconds, he was on top of them, his movements precise and deliberate. The outlaws, stunned by the sudden attack, scrambled to defend themselves. But it was clear that this rider, whoever he was far more skilled than they were. He fought with a controlled fury that sent several of the outlaws fleeing into the woods, their plans falling apart in the face of his power. Sarah watched in awe as the man made quick work of the group. She had never seen anything like it before. The speed, the accuracy, the way he moved like a force of nature. It was as if he had been born for moments like this. When the last outlaw was driven off, the rider turned his attention to Sarah, his eyes scanning her and Lily carefully. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who this man was, but she knew he had just saved them. He was a stranger, but he had risked his life to protect hers. "Are you all right?" the rider asked, his voice calm but firm. It was a voice that carried weight, one that spoke of both authority and compassion. Sarah nodded, still in shock. Yes, we're okay." "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. The rider didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the path ahead, his expression unreadable. "You're not safe yet," he said. "Those men will be back." And with that, the woman and her daughter were left in the presence of this mysterious stranger, one who would soon change their lives forever.